today we're starting chapter 4, and I'm sure it's going to take me today and Wednesday to get to this chapter, maybe even a little bit longer. The topic is cells, and the study of cells didn't begin until the mid-1600s with the development of high-quality lenses that allowed mainly Europeans, or exclusively Europeans, to observe tiny objects that were not visible to the unaided naked eye. This is a sketch by Robert Hooke, an Englishman who used, I believe this is this microscope he actually built and used, I'm not 100% positive of that. He actually took thin slices of cork, I believe from a wine bottle or some plug of it, some type of jar, and he noticed under microscopic examination these little cavities here that he named cells, because they reminded him of the little cubicles where monks would sit and copy manuscripts. And of course he didn't know that he was looking at the space in which a living cell had formerly existed but was now long gone. So he looked at dead spaces. But that's okay, the term stuck. And through the remaining 17th century and into the 1800s, numerous Europeans using high quality lenses began to observe this microscopic world, and hence the field of cytology was more or less sort of gradually established. And this led to 3 Europeans. They're known as Schleiden. These are their names. I believe I spelled that right. Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow. I believe they're all Germans. Somewhere I read Virchow was a Russian, but our book says they're all Germans. I'll take our book's word for it. Right around the mid-1700s, they published independent treatises or works. They're really just descriptive catalogs of looking at lots of things under the microscope. And they realized that every living thing they looked at was composed of cells. And so together, these 3 scientists formalized what's known as the cell theory. And I'll remind you again that a theory in science is not a whim or speculation. It's something based on evidence that's been accumulated, in this case for maybe a quarter of a century. And the cell theory has 3 main points to it. It says that all living things are composed of cells. So far we have no exception to that part of this theory, that the cell is the basic unit of life. That means the pieces of a cell, its components, are not alive. The molecules and structures that make up a cell are not living, but when they're organized at the level of organization of the cell, life is an emergent property that's really not predicted from its components. Okay? All right. And third, and this is Virchow's contribution, that all cells are derived from pre-existing cells. Which means they're produced via cell division. There's 2 main mechanisms, mitosis, meiosis in eukaryotes, and binary fission in prokaryotes. Okay, and this theory has so far stood the test of investigation until today. And it really, it provides us really with a unifying theme about what is life, what is non-life, which had been and sometimes still a philosophical discussion. We often, early in this course, we talked about what are the features of life that distinguish it from non-life. Well, here's one of the key characteristics that distinguishes life, that life is composed of cells and non-life not. So this really provided a criterion for life. And cells also, when we examine cells, we see that they exhibit 2 of the main features of life. We see unity in cell structure and function. Sort of since the cell is the basic unit of life, this is where you want to study life at this level to understand its mechanics. And the mechanics are pretty much, regardless of cell type, the same. We call that's that unity aspect. For example, all cells use DNA as their information molecule. No exceptions to that as far as we know. Okay? As well as a lot of other biochemical features and events shared by all cells. Nevertheless, we see that when we examine life, there's a great diversity of form. We characterize that diversity as identified as individual species, groups of organisms that are reproductively isolated from other groups. And so these are superficially contradictory terms, unity, diversity, but both are characteristics of life. Again, at the cellular level, we can talk about in this chapter about a generic cell to understand the mechanics of life, because those processes are universal to all living things. Yet, just this picture here, we see a diversity of even at the cellular level of structure, of capabilities. And the concept that unifies these two somewhat seemingly contradictory terms are really the idea of natural selection proposed by our hero Charles Darwin, that says when those early cells occurred on our planet, okay, they, of course, the DNA that they possess is the recipe to control almost all their functions. That is their structure, their function, but it also, the DNA has the instructions to copy itself, so it could be passed into daughter cells into the future. And so all living cells today are descendants of those first cells. We are all descendants. All living things today that have ever lived are descendants of those early cells that again use this molecule, which contains the recipe that powers life, but also carries the instruction to copy itself, so copies can be transmitted to future generations through this long line of continual descent. Now, the copying of DNA is an imperfect event. It's not, nothing is perfect. Nothing always gives you a perfect result. And so these imperfections in copying that we call mutations, okay, they may or may not have an impact on the recipes. Okay, we'll talk about at some point in this class. We'll talk about mutations, some that are detrimental. Remember that a copy mistake, a mutation, that's a random change. It's a random misspelling. You can imagine if you randomly misspell a recipe to make something, probably the recipe is going to be less successful. You're going to have something that doesn't taste quite right through a random change. Okay? And so many of these random changes are somewhat probably detrimental to the recipe for whatever they're coding for. All right? And if they're seriously detrimental, it may compromise those cells that inherited that bad copy by mistake, and they perish. They don't have the appropriate instructions to survive. That makes sense, right? That seems logical, right? On a rare occasion, maybe some of these misspellings are actually beneficial. Maybe the cake does taste better now because I added a little more sugar than I was supposed to. Delicious. Okay? And you can imagine, I mean, it seems most likely that a random change would be detrimental, but maybe on rare occasion, a beneficial change. And if it's beneficial enough to increase the survivor of those cells, maybe they can out-survive others, and if you can out-survive, maybe you can out-reproduce. In the future are your descendants. Okay? And of course, probably a lot of these misspellings probably have no real effect on the organism. It might be a neutral change, and all three types of events can occur for a mutation. All right? But these random changes and then shaped by natural selection. Okay, natural selection just means that if I am not as well suited as the neighbor, I don't survive, I don't reproduce, and the future is dictated by those that do survive and reproduce. Okay, so there's no magic here involved. It just means that as cells produce offspring through miscopying events, mutations, the cells are not all exactly like the parent. And some may have changes that doom them to a future, where others might have a benefit. And the future is determined by these individuals. And so you can imagine as this change occurs over generations and cells disperse, living things disperse across the globe, it could ultimately, over many, many long periods of time, lead to a diversity of form. All based on this unity of mechanisms, okay, where all cells basically work the same way. And so these main features of life are really accounted for by this theory of evolution, which is the cornerstone of biology. Biologists say it's not a debatable point. Life can't function without natural selection because, again, the copying mechanisms are imperfect. And if natural selection doesn't operate, then all these misfunctions that accumulate, and life eventually can't survive at all. So this is a requirement for life to be successful on the planet because of the nature of our world, which is unpredictable, and the nature of these mechanisms. Whether it's a living mechanism in a cell or non, mechanisms are never perfect. There's always imperfection. Now, these are examples from our textbook of the diversity of life. We see two examples from the domains in the prokaryotic world: the bacteria and the archaeans. Okay, this is a bacteria that lives in boiling sulfuric acid. Amazing cell. Here, from this point on, C through G, we're talking about cells that belong in the eukarya. Those are cells that have a true nucleus, internal compartments. And that's where we'll spend the bulk of Chapter 4 looking at eukaryotes. Protists, these are, again, mainly single-celled organisms that are somewhat animal-like in that they are heterotrophic. Heterotrophic means what? What is that? What's that?